Welcome back to You Have a Brain by Dr. Benjamin Carson. Enjoy reading. Chapter 4. How We Got Smart. We didn't know what to think the next day when Mother sat Curtis and me down and began to say, "You remember when I told you I was going to pray and ask the Lord to give me wisdom about what to do about your grades?" Like we could have ever forgotten that. We'd thought of little else since. "Yes, ma'am," we assured her. I'd been dying to hear what God had said, but now I wasn't so sure I wanted to know. "I did pray," she said. "Well, I believe God gave me the wisdom I needed." She looked a little uncertain about how to put into words what she was going to say next, as if we probably wouldn't want to hear it. This couldn't be good. "The wisdom I believe God gave me was this," she told us. "We're going to start by turning off the television. And from now on, you may watch 2 or 3 shows each week." When we groaned, she quickly added, "You get to choose the shows, but 3 times per week is it. And you will use all that extra time you have for reading." Oh man, I couldn't believe this. That doesn't even sound reasonable, let alone wise. I was about to voice my protest. But Mother wasn't finished. "You can also choose what you read, at least 2 books each week. Then I will expect you to write 2 book reports on the books you read and present those reports out loud to me." This was worse than I ever imagined. I may have been in my 5th grade year, but I'd never read an entire book other than the books my teachers had assigned to read in class. I couldn't imagine finishing 1 book in a week's time, let alone 2. I started to explain this reality to my mother before she got wedded to this crazy idea. But as far as she was concerned, she had prayed for wisdom and gotten her answer. She had made up her mind. The moment I realized that, I gave up the cause and simply shut my mouth. I must have looked defeated because my mother suddenly said in her gentlest, most lovingly tone, "Benny, honey, don't you see? If you can read, you can learn just about anything you want to know. The doors of the world are open to people who can read." I was 11 years old. I didn't care much about the doors of the world. I was a lot more interested in being outdoors in the world. And there wouldn't be much chance for that if I was stuck inside reading and writing 2 book reports every week. And where were we going to get 2 books a week we would want to read? We couldn't afford to buy that many books. Mother had a plan for that as well. The nearest branch of the Detroit Public Library was within walking distance of where we lived. She told us we could go there any day after school and bring home a stack of interesting books. I still wasn't happy about the idea, but we turned off the TV, and the next day Curtis and I visited the library. At least Mother had said we could read any books we wanted. She wasn't going to choose for us. On that first visit to our public library, I must have looked unhappy and lost because a librarian walked up to me right away and offered to help. She led the way to the children's section and asked if I was looking for a particular book or certain author. I hadn't known there was going to be a pop quiz, and I couldn't come up with an answer. When she realized I was stumped, the librarian asked, "What subjects are you most interested in? What would you like to learn more about?" Finally, a question I could answer. "Animals. I'd always loved and been fascinated by all kinds of living creatures." "Well, do you have some books about animals?" I asked. She smiled. "Lots of them." She led me right to a shelf filled entirely with books about all kinds of animals. I had so many to choose from that it took me a while to decide what to check out. I surprised myself and actually read both books that first week. And I wrote the reports Mother had required and read them out loud to her, still hoping she'd relent and realize she'd been expecting too much. No such luck. She seemed so pleased by what we'd accomplished the first week that we had no chance of escaping week 2. I wrote 2 more book reports that next week as well. The same steady pace continued, 2 books and 2 reports week after week. When we handed the reports to Mother, she would ask us to read our reports aloud to her. When we finished, we'd hand her the paper, and she would spend a few moments looking over it. With intensity on her face, she'd nod and underline something here or there. Then she would smile, put a big check mark on the reports, and hand them back to us. No matter the topic we chose, Mother clearly enjoyed discussing or asking about one of the main points we made. We didn't know until years later that she required us to read the reports out loud because she couldn't read them herself. Her 3rd grade education only enabled her to pick out a few words here and there. What we did know even then was that our mother loved us, wanted only the best for us, and expected us to develop and use our God-given brains. She told us over and over, "If you boys keep reading books, someday people will be watching you on television." That sounded far-fetched to Curtis and me, but the longer her reading plan continued, the more convinced she seemed to be about the wisdom of it. Mother constantly found new ways to underscore her use your brain theme and to convince us of our potential. For example, she began telling us about the lives and habits of the successful, wealthy people whose homes she cleaned every day. "They are no different from us," she insisted. "Anything they can do, you two boys can do. And if you truly want to and you work hard, you can do it even better. You just have to use your brains." On occasion, Mother drove us out to the neighborhoods where she worked. We would gawk at the huge houses as she informed us, "I've noticed something interesting about the people I work for. The people who live in these houses don't watch much television. They all have a lot of books and always seem to be reading and learning. They also work hard first to get a good education, and then they work even harder to become successful in their careers. And because they do all that, they can afford to drive nice cars, build these big houses, and live in this beautiful neighborhood. You need to think about that," she would say. She would continue, "You boys are old enough and smart enough that you've probably noticed that in the neighborhood where we live, many people sit around drinking a lot, spending hours every day watching television, and living month to month on government welfare checks. Most of them will never afford to live anywhere but old rundown houses and apartment buildings in neighborhoods like ours. But now that you see and know the difference, you boys know you have a choice about how and where you will live your lives." Sometimes other parents gave our mother a hard time about the demands and high expectations she placed on Curtis and me. But Mother would hold her ground and tell her concerned friends, "My boys are going to be something when they grow up. And no matter what they decide to do, they're going to be the best in the world at it." Soon, most of the librarians at our branch of the Detroit Public Library knew Curtis and me, and often suggested books for us to read. Sometimes they would even set new books aside if they thought we might be interested in them. So it wasn't long before I'd read all the animal books I could find and began to broaden my interests to books about plants and then rocks. Railroad tracks ran through the part of Detroit where we first lived after we returned from Boston, and all those miles of tracks rested on a graded bed of stone and gravel, consisting of all shapes, sizes, and colors of rock. So I would examine and collect an interesting assortment, carry them home in a box, and compare them to the pictures in the geology and rock books I'd checked out of the library. Before long, I could name virtually every rock I'd pick up, list its distinctive characteristics, tell how it was formed, and sometimes even make an educated guess about where it came from. Obviously, by the time I'd started a rock collection, I had to realize, on some level, that I was learning some new and interesting information from the books I was reading each week. But I don't think I began to understand how much I was learning or what impact that could make in my life, until one memorable day. Mr. Yeck, my fifth-grade science teacher, walked into our classroom carrying a big, shiny black rock. He held it up and asked, "Can anyone tell me what this is?" I immediately knew the rock was obsidian, but I had never raised my hand in class and wasn't inclined to do so now. I had been gradually improving in some of my subjects, but I was still considered the dummy in the class. No one at school knew about my new reading program. So I just sat there looking at the rock in Mr. Yak's hand, waiting for the smart kids to respond to his question. None of them did. I waited long enough for the slow kids to offer an answer. None of them did either. I couldn't believe this. Was this my chance? When I finally put up my hand, I heard someone across the room snicker. Look, Carson's got his hand up. This is going to be good." Every head in the room turned. Every eye looked right at me. Whispers began flowing around the room. The entire class clearly considered this a notable occasion that promised to be funny. "Benjamin." Mr. Jack was as surprised as my classmates. But once he called on me, and I answered, "That's obsidian." All the whispers died a sudden death. I suspect all my classmates were shocked to hear anything come out of my mouth that sounded serious and halfway intelligent, but they were not sure if it was the right answer or a joke. "That's right, it is obsidian," Mr. Yak exclaimed in delight. "What can anyone tell me about obsidian?" I looked around, but no one else said anything, so I continued. Obsidian is formed after a volcanic eruption. Lava flows down, and when it hits water, there is a supercooling process. The elements coalesce, forcing out the air, and the surface glazes over. Right again, Benjamin, Mr. Yak remarked. My classmates sat stunned, their mouths hanging open. Before he went on with his lesson, Mr. Yak asked me to stop by his room after school. When I did, he heard about my rock collection, asked me to bring it in, and offered to help me work on it. Even at that time, I felt fortunate and thrilled that Mr. Yak publicly invited me to talk with him about science after school. Most of my classmates really liked him as a teacher, partly because of his young age, somewhere in his 20s and only a few years out of college. I remember him as tall and slender, with light brown hair and as a stylish dresser. On top of that, Mr. Yak drove a snazzy red convertible, which we all thought was very cool, especially for a teacher. Someone like him taking enough interest to give me individual attention and encouragement was a first in my life kind of thing for me. Saying that, I may need to give a little context here. The civil rights movement regularly made headline news throughout the 1960s. The push for integration continued to face significant resistance. So at that time, not just in the South, but also even in places like Detroit, many, if not most people of other ethnic backgrounds pretty much assumed black kids weren't very bright. Even people who had no interracial animosity of their own sometimes bought into the expectations of that stereotype in large part because they hadn't had enough personal interaction with African Americans to know any better. It wasn't long before Mr. Yak made it clear he enjoyed the hours we spent together after school because he was convinced I had great potential in science. He was thrilled to find a student who seemed genuinely eager to learn and got as excited about science as he did. Virtually every day when the final bell sounded, I raced for the science room. Mr. Yak collected and cared for a menagerie of living creatures in his classroom. I remember him showing me a tarantula he had just acquired accidentally in a bunch of bananas he'd bought. He demonstrated for me how they like to hide in crevices like that. To this day, I look carefully every time I pick up a bunch of bananas. I've never happened upon a tarantula of my own, yet I still think about the possibility, especially when I make a purchase at an outdoor fruit stand or in a foreign country. Another interesting specimen in Mr. Yak's classroom was his Jack Dempsey fish, a Central American freshwater species named for an early 20th century professional boxer because of its fiercely aggressive nature and its prominent and pugnacious facial features. He explained to me that, like a piranha, a Jack Dempsey is primarily a carnivore, so I needed to be especially careful not to put my fingers in the water whenever I fed it. Mr. Yak picked up a pencil by the point and stuck the other end into the aquarium. When that fish darted up and chomped off the entire eraser in a single bite, I immediately learned the lesson. Other creatures that dwelt in various habitats around that science room included a squirrel, crayfish, a salamander, toads, and frogs. I was fascinated by the chance to study them up close, and I was thrilled when Mr. Yak gave me the responsibility to feed and help take care of them. The role and responsibilities of a small-scale zookeeper weren't the only lessons I learned in Mr. Yak's science class after school. He taught me about patience when we monitored some brine shrimp eggs in salt water every afternoon. Some days later, I noticed a few tiny little things wiggling around in the water. A few eggs had hatched, and within a week to 10 days, hundreds of little shrimp swam around our little hatchery. Then we fed them and monitored their growth. For me, the most captivating thing in that science room was Mr. Yak's microscope. I got to the point where I could not walk past a pond, a pool, or even a puddle of water without taking a sample of the water. I'd bring it to the science room, put a drop on a slide, and examine it under the microscope to see what was in the water. Learning about different microorganisms not only fascinated me, it also gave me knowledge almost nobody else I knew had. That went a long way toward turning around my self-image from believing that I was a dummy to understanding that I was actually smart. Mother was right. I had a brain, and it was a good one. If it hadn't been for a young, caring teacher who enjoyed sharing his excitement and love for science with a former class dummy, I don't know how long it might have taken me to figure that out for myself. Mr. Yak became my first mentor, other than my mother, and I'm sure I wasn't the last student to look at him that way. During the summer after 6th grade, He took a few of us students to our first professional sports event, a Detroit Tigers baseball game, and he paid our way. Decades later, when a national television network wanted to do a feature about my life, a camera crew followed me back to Detroit where I reconnected with Mr. Yak, who was fast approaching retirement and still teaching science in one of that city's elementary schools. There I was able to publicly recognize and thank him for the role he played in setting me on the road to a successful future. Thank you so much for joining us on this reading adventure on You Have a Brain by Dr. Benjamin Carson. We hope you've enjoyed our content and found it enlightening. If you've liked what you've seen and read, we'd be thrilled if you could give us a thumbs up, share our channel with your fellow book lovers, and subscribe for more amazing reading experiences. Until next time, happy reading.